The sun was too bright. It wasn't right, not in the way the morning sun should feel. John felt his skin tingle as though it were waking up for the first time, but the feeling was wrong. The sensation didn't belong in his body. He frowned and rubbed his eyes. It was a quiet morning in a quiet city, but that didn't seem to make any sense anymore. There was something missing. Something had changed, and John couldn't quite place what. His hands slid across the rough fabric of his bed sheets, pushing himself up. He usually woke up to the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint murmur of traffic outside, or the quiet buzz of his phone notifications. But today there was nothing. No buzzing, no low hums, just eerie silence. John stretched out, feeling the stiffness in his limbs as though he hadn't moved in years. There was a heaviness in the air that made his breath feel shallow, and as he sat up, his feet met the cold floor with an almost unnatural sharpness. A soft clink echoed from the kitchen. It was the sound of metal, but not the kind of sound one makes in a house that still feels warm with human life. It was something robotic, mechanical. It sent a shiver through John's spine. The city outside his window was just as still. The buildings, the streets, the cars parked neatly at the curb, they all felt wrong. It was as though the world had been paused, frozen in time, and he was the only one who had yet to notice. John blinked a few times, still groggy, trying to shake the fog from his mind. What's going on? His voice was raspy, thin, and it bounced back to him, eerily off the walls. Was that his voice? Had he always sounded like that? He couldn't remember. With a sense of dread settling into his gut, he dragged himself to the window. He looked down at the street below, expecting to see people milling about, perhaps a few joggers or pedestrians hurrying to work, but there was no movement. No bustling, just rows of perfectly still cars parked in place. And then it hit him. There was something off about the figures in the windows. People? They weren't moving. No, they weren't people at all. His eyes widened, heart pounding, as he saw the figure of a man standing outside his building. He couldn't see his face, but the posture, rigid, stiff, struck him like a slap. The man was motionless, his eyes wide, unblinking, staring straight ahead. John's breath caught in his throat. He rubbed his eyes again, as though the image before him was some twisted trick of light. But no, it was still there. And then the man turned, slowly, like a machine forced into motion. His movements were stiff and jerky, not human at all. John's mind reeled. He stepped back from the window, a cold sweat starting to form on his brow. No! No, no, no! He muttered to himself, backing away. But what was it? What was going on? The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and in a state of shock, John pulled his phone from his pocket, only to find the screen blank. It flickered once and went dead. He cursed under his breath and tried again. Nothing. His phone had been working fine yesterday. He never had problems with it. But now it was useless, just like the world outside. He threw the phone down on his bed in frustration and stumbled out of the apartment, hoping for answers, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. The building lobby was silent as he passed through it. A few plants near the entrance were wilted, though that was the only sign of life, if you could even call it that. Even the doorman, who usually greeted him every morning with a slight nod and a grunt of recognition, was absent. John's heart sank. He reached the door and pulled it open. Outside, the air was thick with something he couldn't define. A strange, metallic scent wafted in, and the silence seemed even more oppressive now that he was outside. No birds chirped, no cars honked, no people argued over the price of a coffee or called out to friends. The world had somehow flattened. It was as if all life had been drained from it. John turned, his head spinning. He spotted another figure standing across the street, a man in a suit. At first, he thought it was just someone going about their business, but there was something wrong. The figure was standing completely still, staring forward with unblinking eyes. His arms hung rigidly at his sides. John's throat went dry. Another one. Was he the only one left? Had they all turned into this? He couldn't even bring himself to cross the street to see if the man was okay. His heart hammered in his chest and his legs felt heavy, like they were filled with lead. The idea of being completely alone, of having no one to turn to, made him feel small, insignificant. Hello, John called out, his voice trembling, unsure of what he even expected. Was anyone out there? Would someone help him? He didn't know what he needed, but he felt the desperate urge to hear someone else's voice. Nothing, no response. And then suddenly, a voice, a mechanical click filled the air. A woman's voice, but it didn't sound human. It was sharp and metallic, as though it were coming from a speaker. "You are the last one," it said, and the words hit John like a blow. "The others have transitioned." "Transitioned!" John echoed, his breath catching in his throat. "The last one? Transitioned? What did that even mean? What are you talking about? Where is everyone else?" But the voice only repeated the words, "You are the last one." John's chest tightened, and a sense of hopelessness washed over him like a flood. He looked up at the sky as if expecting some answer, but all he saw was the same blank, pale blue. No clouds, no birds, just a barren expanse. He turned back to look at the people in the streets, all standing still, and the terror crept up his spine like an icy hand. Am I the last human?" he whispered to himself, as if asking the question aloud would somehow make it untrue. But deep inside, he knew the answer. John was alone, and the world had become something else, something cold, mechanical, something far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. John's heart raced as the metallic voice echoed in his mind. The last one. The words reverberated like a drumbeat inside his skull, and he stumbled back onto the sidewalk. He couldn't take it. His breath caught in his throat, and his legs felt weak beneath him. For a moment, it felt like everything had stopped. The street, the people, all still, just frozen in time. There was no movement, no hope. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind. He had to find answers. He couldn't just stand here, trapped in this empty world, with no one to talk to, no one to help. He glanced at the figures surrounding him, the lifeless, mechanical forms that looked like humans but weren't. His stomach churned at the sight of them. Then something caught his eye. Far down the street, at the very end, a faint shadow shifted. John blinked and rubbed his eyes again. No, it couldn't be. His heart began to race, a sliver of hope cutting through the suffocating despair. Someone was moving. Someone was alive. Hello? John shouted, his voice breaking the silence. He bolted down the street, ignoring the strange sensation in his legs. His footsteps echoed in the emptiness. He didn't care anymore. He had to know if he wasn't truly alone. The figure ahead of him was moving slowly with uncertain steps. It didn't look like one of them. He reached the corner and stopped short, nearly colliding with the figure that stood before him. A woman. She was tall, her dark hair tousled as if she had just woken up. Her clothes were wrinkled, as though she had been asleep for days. Her eyes, wide with confusion and fear, met his. Her breath came in shallow gasps. John couldn't breathe. His voice cracked, desperate. Are you real? Are you human?" The woman blinked at him, her gaze flickering with uncertainty. She took a step back, looking over her shoulder as though checking for something. Or someone. "Are you the last one?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Am I the last one?" John nodded, his throat tight. Yes, I think so. I woke up and everyone else they're not human anymore. They've turned into machines or something. What's happening?" His voice cracked on the last word. The woman shook her head, her brow furrowing. She looked just as lost and terrified as he felt, but her fear was tempered by a quiet determination. "I don't know. I woke up too. I thought I was dreaming at first, but then I saw them. People, but not people. Robots, I think. They just stand there like they're waiting for something. I don't know what happened." John glanced at the crowd of lifeless figures around them. "They're everywhere," he whispered, almost as if speaking the words aloud would make them more real. "What if we're the last two?" The woman shook her head again, her eyes searching the street for any sign of movement. "No, I can't be the last one. There must be more of us. There has to be." Her voice was steady but tinged with desperation. "We can't be alone. Not like this." John felt his heart swell with a mixture of hope and fear. Maybe there were more people out there. Maybe they could find them. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the hope began to falter, like a flame struggling against the wind. "What do we do now?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's face tightened, her fists clenching at her sides. "We survive. We figure this out. We have to. I don't know what happened, but I know we're not supposed to be the last ones." John didn't know how to respond. His mind was spinning. They needed a plan, but everything felt so surreal, so utterly out of control. What had happened to the world? What had happened to the people? "Where are you from?" he asked, hoping to hold on to something familiar, something that could anchor him in the chaos. "I?" The woman paused, her face twitching in confusion. She seemed to be searching for the answer, but then her expression hardened. "I don't even know. I don't remember. I don't know who I am anymore." John felt a pit form in his stomach. She didn't remember who she was. Who had she been? They were both adrift, cut off from everything that had been their reality. Nothing felt the same. Not the city, not the people, not even themselves. "Well," John said, forcing a nervous chuckle, "we might not know who we are, but we know what we need to do. We need to find shelter, food, and we need to figure out what happened to everyone." The woman nodded, her eyes bright with a mix of resolve and fear. "Right, we'll figure it out, together." They turned and began to walk side by side through the eerie silence of the city. The world around them was still, too still. The occasional figure they passed remained motionless, like statues, their eyes glazed and unblinking. They didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even seem to notice them. John's stomach twisted at the thought. What had happened to these people? They looked like they were waiting for something. But what? Were they waiting for the same thing he and the woman were? Some kind of answer? Or were they simply waiting for the end? "I don't know how long we'll be able to survive like this," John murmured, his voice barely audible over the sound of their footsteps. The woman gave him a quick, sharp glance, her face hardening. "We'll survive. We have to." As they moved deeper into the city, John's thoughts raced. What if there were others? What if there were more survivors hidden away, just waiting to be found? Could they be the key to fixing whatever had gone wrong? Could they be the ones to stand against whatever had taken over the world? But even as hope stirred, the terror remained. What if we are the last two? John didn't have an answer. He didn't know where to begin. The streets, the buildings, they all looked the same, and yet they were so alien now, so foreign. The normal rules of the world no longer applied. "I'm scared," John confessed suddenly, his voice low, almost ashamed to admit it. The woman's gaze softened, and for the first time since they met, a flicker of something, compassion, appeared in her eyes. "Me too, but we have each other, right? We can get through this." John nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed it. He wanted to, more than anything. He wanted to believe that there was something left worth fighting for. But as they turned another corner, the stillness of the world pressed in on them once more, and the truth seemed clearer than ever before. They were alone in this, and maybe, just maybe, they were the last two who could make a difference. John and the woman whom he'd learned was named Evelyn walked deeper into the city, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. They passed abandoned shops with cracked windows, their doors left ajar, as if whoever had lived there had simply vanished without a trace. Evelyn glanced each of the buildings they passed, as though hoping for some sign of life, but there was nothing. John's mind was spinning with questions. Why had the world changed? Why were they left behind? And what exactly were those things that once resembled people? Were they truly robots, or something else entirely? The metallic voice that had spoken to him kept repeating itself in his head. "You are the last one." The silence around them was suffocating, but there was no time to dwell on it. They needed food, shelter, and answers. Their survival depended on it. John turned to Evelyn. "We need to get to higher ground, a rooftop or somewhere we can see the whole city. Maybe we can find more survivors, or at least figure out where we are." Evelyn nodded, though her face was taut with unease. "Do you think there are more of us? I can't shake the feeling that we're the last." "I don't know," John admitted, his voice tight. "But I have to believe we're not. There must be more people out there. We can't be the only ones left." As they continued through the city, the tension in the air grew heavier. It was as though they were being watched. Every corner they turned, every alley they passed, John's senses screamed that something was off, that something dangerous was lurking in the shadows. The wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the scent of rust and something metallic like blood. John's stomach twisted. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He wasn't just afraid, he was on edge. every part of him alert, waiting for something to happen. Then, without warning, a loud crash came from behind them. Evelyn froze and John whirled around, his heart racing. From the alleyway at the end of the block, a figure emerged, tall, broad-shouldered and rigid in its movements. John's breath hitched. Not another one. This one was different, though. Its movements were jerky, mechanical, like the others, but there was something else, a faint whirring sound coming from its chest. The figure took a step forward and John could see the gleam of metal beneath its tattered clothing. Its eyes were glassy, glowing faintly with an eerie light. "Run!" John shouted, grabbing Evelyn's arm. "Now!" They sprinted down the street, the sound of their footsteps blending with the loud mechanical hum that followed them. John dared not look back. He could hear the thing gaining on them, its stiff movements too quick for comfort. He felt a surge of panic rising in his chest. They had to escape, had to find somewhere safe. "Where are we going?" Evelyn gasped, struggling to keep up with his pace. Her breath came in shallow, desperate gasps. I don't know. Just run." John's voice cracked with fear. They turned a corner and ducked into an alley, but the whirring noise followed them, relentless. John's eyes darted around, searching for any way to escape. The alley was a dead end. Panic surged through his veins as they skidded to a stop. The figure was closing in. They had no choice but to face it. The thing stood at the end of the alley now, its head tilted to the side like it was assessing them, its mechanical gaze locked onto John and Evelyn. They were trapped. Then, without warning, Evelyn did something John hadn't expected. She lunged forward, grabbing a broken metal pipe from the ground and holding it up defensively. Her eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else, a spark of defiance. She wasn't going down without a fight. "Get ready!" Evelyn shouted, her voice shaking. She held the pipe out in front of her, as though daring the creature to make a move. John's mind raced. He wasn't sure they could fight this thing off. It was too strong, too fast. But they had no choice. He grabbed a piece of debris from the ground, a jagged shard of glass, and held it in front of him, like a weapon. "Don't get too close," John warned, his heart pounding. "We need to get out of here." But the creature didn't move. Instead, it took a step back, its mechanical limbs making a loud clicking sound as it shifted. Evelyn frowned, her grip tightening on the pipe. "What's it doing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. John didn't have time to answer. Without warning, the creature raised its arm and a loud, high-pitched whirring noise filled the air. A beam of light shot from its hand, illuminating the alley. The beam hit the ground inches from John's feet, causing him to stumble backward in shock. "Move!" John yelled, pulling Evelyn's arm as they both scrambled to the side, barely dodging the second beam of light. They had to escape. The thing seemed to hesitate, as if unsure of how to respond. For a split second, John thought they might actually have a chance, but then the creature moved again. This time, it lunged at them. Evelyn swung the pipe with all her strength, connecting with the creature's arm. A loud, metallic clang rang through the alley, but the thing didn't even flinch. Instead, it turned its attention to her, its glowing eyes narrowing in on her. "Run!" John screamed again, dragging Evelyn back. They sprinted down the alley, the creature following them relentlessly. They could hear its heavy footsteps behind them, its whirring and clicking growing louder. Then, as if by some miracle, they reached an open area, an abandoned courtyard with a large, crumbling building in the centre. They dove for cover behind the ruins, gasping for breath. John peered around the corner, watching the creature as it approached the entrance to the courtyard. It seemed to stop for a moment, scanning the area, its head swivelling as though searching for them. "What now?" Evelyn breathed, her voice frantic. John's mind raced. They couldn't just keep running. They needed a plan. They needed to find a way to disable the creature. But how? Suddenly, a thought occurred to him. The beam of light. That powerful, destructive energy. If they could somehow turn its weapon against it, maybe they'd have a chance. "Stay here," John whispered to Evelyn, his voice determined. "I'm going to get its attention." Evelyn's eyes widened with panic. "No, you can't." "I have to," John said firmly. "We don't have any other choice." With his heart pounding, he stepped out from behind the building, walking slowly toward the creature. He kept his movements deliberate, not wanting to provoke it too quickly. As he neared, he felt the tension in his chest tighten, his palms sweaty. "Hey!" John shouted, his voice echoing in the courtyard. The creature turned at the sound, its head snapping toward him, its glowing eyes locking onto him. John swallowed hard. This was it. It raised its arm again, preparing to fire the beam, but this time John was ready. He sprinted to the side, ducking behind an overturned piece of concrete just as the beam shot past him, missing him by inches. The creature hesitated, and that was all the time John needed. Grabbing a nearby piece of metal, he hurled it toward the creature's exposed circuitry. A loud screeching sound filled the air as sparks flew from the creature's body. It staggered back, its movements jerky and disjointed. For the first time, it seemed vulnerable. "Now!" John shouted. Evelyn rushed forward, wielding the pipe once more. Together, they lunged at the creature, determined to make their move before it recovered. But even as the creature faltered, John felt a new sense of fear. There was something much bigger at play here, something they still didn't understand. Whatever had turned these people into machines, whatever had triggered this bizarre transformation, was only just beginning to reveal its true power. And John was beginning to realize something even more terrifying. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for the future of humanity itself. The creature staggered, its metal frame groaning as sparks fizzled from the wound John had inflicted. For a moment it seemed as though it might fall, but then it straightened up, its glowing eyes flickering in the dim light of the courtyard. The hum of its mechanical body filled the air, vibrating the ground beneath their feet. John's heart hammered in his chest, his mind racing for what to do next. It was now or never. "Evelyn! Now!" John shouted, his voice rough with fear. Evelyn's face was pale, but there was a spark in her eyes. She gripped the pipe tighter, nodding, ready. They had no choice but to act. Together they charged at the creature, their steps pounding against the cracked stone of the courtyard. The creature's head swiveled toward them with a sudden, unnerving precision. Before John could even react, its mechanical arm shot out, firing another beam of light. The beam whipped past them, narrowly missing, but the intense heat scorched the air as it passed. John ducked instinctively, the beam's wake burning his skin. "Watch out!" Evelyn cried, her voice strained as she lunged forward, raising the pipe. John glanced back quickly, seeing the creature retreating as though it was recalibrating itself. Was it afraid? Or was it just planning its next move? Evelyn swung at the creature's leg, hitting it with a loud metallic clang. The creature jerked back as if surprised, and then, without warning, it launched itself at them with frightening speed. John's stomach dropped. He grabbed Evelyn's arm, yanking her away from the oncoming machine. But the force of his pull sent them both tumbling to the ground. They scrambled to their feet, but before they could recover, the creature was already upon them. It was then that John saw it, the glimmer of something embedded deep in the creature's chest, a weak spot he hadn't noticed before, a small flickering light. A power source? "We can't fight it like this!" John yelled, his voice full of panic, but Evelyn wasn't listening. She was already moving. She darted toward the creature's side, keeping her distance but positioning herself in a way that would give them the upper hand. "Evelyn, don't!" John screamed, but it was too late. She reached the creature's side and swung the pipe, aiming for the exposed light in its chest. The impact was deafening, a high-pitched screech echoing through the courtyard as the pipe connected with the metal casing. Sparks flew and the creature reeled back, staggering as if it had been hit by a powerful shock. "Hit it again!" Evelyn shouted, her voice full of desperation. John didn't need to be told twice. His pulse raced as he grabbed a heavy piece of concrete from the ground and hurled it toward the creature's chest. The concrete struck its damaged casing with a loud crack, sending another shockwave through the courtyard. The creature staggered, its movements jerky and unstable now, as though it could no longer maintain its balance. But despite the damage, it wasn't down yet. John felt the pressure rising inside him, the pressure of time, of the unknown, of everything that had brought him to this point. He had no idea how much longer they could keep this up. The creature was relentless. Its arms whirred as it extended them toward them, preparing for another attack. Its head tilted, its glowing eyes narrowing. But Evelyn wasn't done yet. With a defiant cry, she rushed forward once more, the pipe raised high. Her body was shaking with exertion, but she didn't stop. She swung the pipe downward, aiming at the creature's chest once again. There was a deafening crack, followed by a sudden, piercing silence. The creature froze, its limbs stiffening in midair. For a heartbeat, it hung motionless, as though the life had drained out of it. John's breath caught in his throat. Had they done it? Then, without warning, the creature's body jerked violently. Sparks exploded from its joints, and the hum of its mechanical body reached a deafening crescendo. John threw his arms up, instinctively protecting his face, as the creature shuddered and collapsed to the ground with a terrible clang. The sound of its metal body crashing against the stone floor echoed through the empty courtyard, and for a moment everything was still. John's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to Evelyn. They were both breathing hard, their bodies covered in grime and sweat, but they had done it. They had defeated the creature. But the relief was short-lived. The ground beneath their feet trembled suddenly, and John's eyes widened in horror. The courtyard was shaking as if an earthquake was ripping through the city. The air itself seemed to thrum with energy, and he could hear a faint mechanical hum growing louder and louder. "What's happening?" Evelyn gasped, her voice trembling. She took a step backward, her eyes wide with fear. "Stay close!" John shouted, grabbing her arm as the ground continued to quake. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tremors stopped. The courtyard fell silent once more. But something had changed. From the ruins of the fallen creature, a new sound began to emerge, a faint mechanical buzzing, like a swarm of bees. John's blood ran cold as the ground before them began to crack open, revealing more creatures emerging from the earth. They were like the one they had just destroyed, but there were dozens of them. Their glowing eyes blinked to life, and they all turned toward John and Evelyn in unison. The machines were coming. John's breath quickened, his heart hammering in his chest. "Evelyn, we need to move. Now!" But Evelyn didn't move. She stood there, frozen, staring at the machines that were now crawling out of the ground, their metallic bodies gleaming in the dim light. I don't understand," she whispered. "What are they?" John didn't have an answer. There were too many. There was no way they could fight them all off. But there was one thing John knew for sure. They couldn't stay here. "We have to get to the city's power grid," he shouted. "It's the only chance we have. If we can shut it down, maybe we can stop all of this." Evelyn's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked as if she were about to protest. But the sight of the approaching machines changed her mind. Her face hardened with determination. "Lead the way," she said. John took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. Together, they turned and ran, their footsteps pounding the earth as the machines behind them began to follow. Every second felt like an eternity. Every step carried the weight of their survival. The machines were relentless, but they had one advantage. They were still human. And for now, that was enough. As they sprinted toward the power grid, John's thoughts raced. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to reclaim their world, and they weren't going to stop until they had it back. The city sprawled before them like a living, breathing thing, its towering structures now seeming fragile against the oncoming storm of machines. John's heart thudded in his chest as he and Evelyn sprinted through the winding streets, the distant hum of the mechanical creatures growing louder with each passing second. The power grid was close. He could almost see the sparks flying from the broken wires, a lifeline to a future he had only just begun to hope for. "We're almost there!" John shouted, his breath ragged, but his determination stronger than ever. Evelyn's face was pale, her eyes wide with exhaustion, but she didn't falter. She matched his pace, her resolve solidifying with every step. They had come so far, fought so hard. There was no way they could stop now. As they neared the power grid, John could feel the air changing, the electric hum becoming more pronounced. It was like standing on the edge of a precipice with everything in their hands. The machines were closing in, but if they could just get to the control room, they might have a chance. He glanced over his shoulder, seeing a mass of glowing eyes behind them. The machines were relentless, their movements fast and precise. "Just a little further," he urged Evelyn, though he could feel the weight of their situation settling in. They were out of time. Then suddenly, Evelyn's foot caught on a broken piece of pavement and she stumbled. John reached out, grabbing her arm just before she fell. Her breath hitched, and for a moment everything seemed to freeze. "We don't have time for this," John said, his voice tight with fear. He didn't know if he could carry both of them. The machines were closing in, faster than he ever expected. Evelyn shook her head, regaining her balance. "I'm fine. Let's go," she said, her voice strained but determined. Together they surged forward, their legs pumping, every second feeling like an eternity. The power grid loomed ahead, its massive metal doors gleaming in the dim light. It felt like the city itself was holding its breath. John's hand flew to the door's control panel, fingers trembling as he fumbled for the override switch. It was a shot in the dark, but it was their only hope. He slapped the button with a frantic swipe, the red lights flashing over them. The door groaned open. John and Evelyn rushed inside, the heavy doors slamming shut behind them, cutting off the sound of the machines for a moment. The room was cold, sterile, filled with the hum of electrical equipment. Screens blinked to life, showing a complex grid of power lines running through the city. "We need to shut it down," Evelyn said, her voice breathless, her eyes scanning the array of switches and buttons. "Here," John said, spotting the main terminal. His hands flew across the keys, typing in the override code they had deciphered during their journey. It felt like hours passed in the few seconds it took for the terminal to respond. Finally, with a soft beep, the screen flashed a warning: shutdown initiated. The room seemed to hold its breath as the hum of the machines outside faltered. John's heart skipped a beat. Were they too late? Was it working? Then, without warning, the lights in the room flickered and the electrical hum began to slow. A sudden silence fell over the city, so deep and all-encompassing that it felt as if the world had come to a standstill. "Did we do it?" Evelyn whispered, her voice almost afraid to break the stillness. John exhaled in relief. "I think we did." But as the minutes stretched on, the stillness became heavier. The machines outside had stopped moving, but the sense of foreboding didn't fade. Something wasn't right. The power grid was down, but it felt like the calm before a storm. Suddenly, the door to the control room rattled violently. John's stomach lurched. Was it the machines trying to break in, or something else? Before he could react, the door burst open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway. A tall man, dressed in the same uniform John had seen in the control room earlier, stepped into the room. His face was hard, but there was something familiar in his eyes, something that made John's heart skip a beat. "Who are you?" John demanded, his hand reaching for the emergency lock. The man held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "It's over. You've done it," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. "The machines are gone." John's mind raced. "You're one of them. You've been controlling this whole thing, haven't you?" The man shook his head slowly. "I didn't control the machines. I helped create them. But I didn't know what they would become. I didn't know they would turn on us all." John's fists clenched. "You're saying you were part of this?" "I'm sorry," the man cut in, his voice filled with regret. "But you need to understand, what's happening now isn't just about the machines. They were only a symptom of something much larger." Evelyn took a step forward, her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? What do you mean?" The man lowered his gaze. "The power grid you just shut down," he gestured around the room. "It's part of a larger network, a system that controls everything. The machines were never meant to be this unstoppable. But there are others. People who want to see the system fail, who want to use the machines for their own gain. If you think this is over, you're wrong." John and Evelyn exchanged a look. The weight of his words settled on them like a stone, and the silence that followed seemed even more suffocating than before. "What now?" Evelyn asked softly, her voice steady despite the tremor of fear beneath. The man looked back at the door, as though contemplating his next words carefully. "Now, we fight back. We start over. Together." John felt a heavy sense of inevitability wash over him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't done yet. With the machines silent for now, and the power grid finally under control, John and Evelyn had achieved what they thought was impossible, but there was still much left to be done. And in the end, it wouldn't just be about survival. It would be about rebuilding, reclaiming what had been lost, and fighting against the forces that had once threatened to consume them all. As the man disappeared into the hallway, John looked at Evelyn, his heart still heavy with the knowledge of the long road ahead. But for the first time in a long time, there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "We'll make it through this," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Evelyn nodded, her expression one of resolve. Together. As the days passed, the silence in the city lingered, heavy and unnerving. The hum of machines had been silenced, but the atmosphere was thick with uncertainty. John and Evelyn stood in the power grid control room, watching the screens flicker in quiet anticipation. Their breaths came in shallow gasps, the weight of their victory settling into a mixture of disbelief and hope. "We did it," Evelyn murmured, her voice trembling with exhaustion and relief. John nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the now dormant city outside the control room. The streets, once a battleground of machines and chaos, were eerily still. It felt as if time itself had paused, waiting for them to make the next move. Despite the silence, John's heart pounded in his chest. They had survived, but they still weren't free. There were still too many unknowns. "So, now what?" Evelyn asked, her eyes wide with uncertainty. The weight of the question was heavy in the air between them. John stepped away from the terminal, his mind racing with possibilities. He had no clear plan, no roadmap to guide him through the uncertainty. But one thing was certain. They couldn't stay in this room forever. The world outside had been broken, but it wasn't beyond repair. They had fought hard to reach this point, and now they had to rebuild. Together. "We move forward," John said, his voice more determined than he felt. "We find the others. We bring them here. We'll need their help to get everything back up and running." Evelyn looked at him, a faint smile playing at the corner of her lips. "You always know what to say." John shook his head, a dry chuckle escaping him. "I don't know, Evelyn. I've been making it up as I go along." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "But we can't do this alone. We can't fix everything by ourselves. We need to find the people who can help us." The thought of facing the unknown, of venturing back out into a world still full of hidden dangers, made his stomach twist. But Evelyn was right. Together they could face whatever came next. With a determined nod, Evelyn turned to the control panel. Her fingers hovered over the buttons, unsure of what to do next. "Should we start sending out a signal?" she asked, uncertainty lacing her words. John stepped up behind her, placing his hand gently on her shoulder. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "Let's start with a signal. Let the others know we're alive. And maybe, just maybe, we can start rebuilding." The room hummed as Evelyn initiated the broadcast, sending out the first message since the city had fallen silent. John's heart raced in his chest, but he knew they couldn't wait forever. The message was a simple one, but it carried a weight that neither of them could have predicted. "We are still here. We are still fighting. Join us." As the message broadcasted across the city, the room felt oddly still, as though the entire world was holding its breath. They waited, watching the screens, hoping for a response, anything to show that they weren't alone, that they hadn't fought all this way for nothing. Minutes passed. Then a small flicker on the screen. The image was grainy, distorted, but the message was clear. "We hear you." "We're coming." John's breath caught in his throat. He turned to Evelyn, his heart soaring. "They heard us. They're coming." Evelyn's eyes widened and she gave a shaky laugh, her shoulders sagging with relief. "We're not alone," she whispered. John smiled, but it was a smile filled with exhaustion and hope. They had come this far, but the real work was just beginning. The days that followed were filled with intense preparation. John and Evelyn worked tirelessly, using what remained of the power grid to scan for survivors, track the movement of the machines, and set up a secure perimeter around the control room. It wasn't enough to just survive. They needed to ensure that they could protect whatever came next. They had to rebuild, but this time they would be ready. On the third day after sending the message, the first survivors arrived. A small group, no more than 10 people, appeared on the horizon, walking cautiously toward the power grid control room. They were wary, but they had heard the call. It was a mix of young and old, men and women, all with the same weary determination in their eyes. John and Evelyn greeted them with a mixture of relief and caution. Trust would take time, but for now, they were allies, united by a common goal. Over the next few weeks, more and more survivors trickled in. The once dominant machines had become a distant memory, their reign broken by the courage of those who had refused to succumb to the fear. But rebuilding was no easy task. Resources were scarce. The machines had torn through the city's infrastructure, and it would take time to restore what had been lost. Yet there was a strange sense of optimism in the air. The survivors worked together, combining their skills and knowledge to start the long process of restoration. It wasn't just about fixing the power grid or rebuilding the city's infrastructure. It was about restoring hope. Hope that humanity had not been entirely consumed by the machines. Hope that they could still find their way back from the edge of annihilation. John found himself in constant motion, organising teams, setting up defensive measures, and ensuring that the survivors had everything they needed to rebuild their lives. He had become a leader in this new world, but it wasn't a role he had ever wanted. All he wanted was to survive. But now, survival had a new meaning. It wasn't just about staying alive. It was about rebuilding something worth living for. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John sat on the steps of the control room, his thoughts heavy. Evelyn sat beside him, her presence a constant source of support. Together, they watched as the survivors worked to erect the first new building, a symbol of their resilience. "We've come a long way," Evelyn said softly, her voice tinged with both weariness and wonder. "I never thought we'd make it this far." John turned to her, his face filled with a quiet gratitude. "We didn't do it alone. We had each other." Evelyn smiled, the weight of everything they had endured reflected in the softness of her gaze. "Together," she said simply, and in that moment, John realised that they had learned something vital throughout their journey. It wasn't just about fighting against the machines or surviving in a broken world. It was about the connections they had formed, the relationships that had carried them through the darkness. They had learned that, no matter the odds, the human spirit was stronger than anything they had faced, and that was something no machine could ever take away. The world wasn't fixed yet, but it was healing. And in that quiet moment, with the stars emerging in the sky above, John knew that they had truly begun to rebuild not just the city, but the hope of humanity itself.